Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told as podcast. If you're like me and you love a good mystery, you're in for a treat today. We're going deep into one of the most infamous cases in American history, the Black Dahlia.
It's one of those cases that just captures the imagination, you know? It's become almost like a modern myth.
Totally. It's got Hollywood glamour, a gruesome murder, and it's a mystery that's been unsolved for decades. It's like a real-life film noir.
Yeah,
Well,
exactly. All those shadowy figures and clues that lead to dead ends, it definitely keeps you guessing.
So let's set the scene. It's 1947 in Los Angeles.
Mm.
World War II has just ended, and there's this feeling of both hope and uncertainty in the air. People are trying to get back to normal, and Hollywood is booming.
And right in the middle of all this, we have Elizabeth Short, a young woman with big dreams of becoming a star.
She was like so many others who went to Hollywood, hoping to make it big. But her story takes a very dark turn.
On January 15th, 1947, her body was found in a vacant lot. And the scene, it was absolutely horrific.
It was more than tragic.
Mhm.
I mean, her body was cut and half drained of blood and posed in this way that was almost deliberate, like some kind of artwork.
It wasn't just a murder, it was a message. And the killer made sure everyone knew it.
You're talking about a Glasgow smile, right? That's something I'll never forget about this case.
Exactly. The killer carved this grin into Elizabeth Short's face. It shows how brutal the crime was, but also how much planning went into it.
It makes you think about the killer's mind. Like, what kind of person could do something like that?
That's the million-dollar question. That's what keeps investigators and everyone else wondering all these years later.
So we have this young woman with Hollywood dreams, a murder scene that's straight out of a nightmare, and this detail, the Glasgow smile, that's become infamous.
And then there's the nickname, the Black Dahlia.
I always thought it was because she wore dahlias in her hair.
That's what a lot of people think. Actually, it came from the newspapers. They were playing off a popular movie at the time called The Blue Dahlia.
The media always knows how to spin a story, even back then.
You know it. And the Black Dahlia nickname just stuck. It fit the whole dark and mysterious mood around the case.
All that attention from the press must have put a ton of pressure on the investigation.
Oh, for sure. The LAPD was in the hot seat. They had to find the killer.
I read that they had hundreds of officers working on the case.
And don't forget, the thousands of tips flooding in. It was massive. But having so much information also made things really confusing.
It must have been like looking for a tiny clue in a giant pile of junk.
Exactly. And on top of all that, the killer seemed to be toying with the police.
Are you talking about the letters sent to the Examiner?
Those letters, they're like a whole other chapter in this story. They were made of words cut out from newspapers, and get this, they were cleaned with gasoline, just like Elizabeth Short's body.
It's just creepy.
It tells us the killer was meticulous and in control. They weren't just trying to get away. They wanted to be a part of the story.
Wow, this is gripping. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the Black Dahlia case, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the rest of this story.
And those letters weren't just to scare people. They also had some of Elizabeth Short's things in them, like her birth certificate and some photos.
It's like he was sending them souvenirs.
Exactly. Chilling souvenirs. And, of course, the media went wild. It just added to the mystery, and everyone was hooked.
So we have a media frenzy, a killer who's playing games and clues that go nowhere.
Which brings us to the suspects. And this is where things get really interesting. There were so many suspects in the Black Dahlia case, you wouldn't believe it.
I know, it's crazy how many people were considered possible suspects.
Each one had some kind of connection to Elizabeth Short, even if it was just a small one. And there was always some theory about why they might have done it.
Was there anyone who seemed like a really strong suspect?
One name that always comes up is Mark Hansen. He owned a nightclub and knew Elizabeth Thing. Some people think she might have turned him down and he wanted revenge.
Sounds like a classic story of obsession.
It definitely fits the whole film noir vibe of the case.
But did they ever find any real proof that Hansen was involved?
Not really. He was a major suspect at first, but eventually they cleared him, and that's kind of how it goes with this case. Lots of interesting leads, but nothing solid.
Like trying to catch smoke.
Yeah, and as time goes on, it just gets harder and harder to figure out what really happened.
So if it wasn't Hansen, who else did they look at? Were there any other suspects who seemed promising?
Oh yeah, there are quite a few others who caught the attention of the investigators. Some were linked to Elizabeth through her time in Hollywood and others through her personal life.
It's like her life, especially in those last few months, was full of all these connections, and any one of them could have led to her killer.
Exactly. That's what made this case so difficult for the investigators. They had to sort through this huge mess of information and try to find the real clues.
I can't imagine what it was like back then with so many suspects and the media frenzy going on. It must have been tough to stay focused.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another theory that's been around for a long time. What if Elizabeth Short's murder was the work of a serial killer?
Now, that's a scary thought.
There are some similarities between this case and other unsolved murders from that time period, like the Cleveland Torso murders.
Both cases involved bodies being dismembered, right?
Yes, and they both happened within a few years of each other. So some people think the same person might have committed both crimes.
That's terrifying. To think that the Black Dahlia case could be just one part of something even bigger and more horrific.
It really plays into the fears people had after the war, the fear of the unknown, and the sense that danger could be lurking anywhere, even in a place as glamorous as Los Angeles.
The Black Dahlia case kind of became a symbol of how fragile life is and how quickly things can go wrong.
Exactly. It showed that even though people were trying to rebuild their lives, there were still dark forces out there.
It's a sobering thought, but it also makes you want to keep searching for answers, even if they're hard to find.
That's the power of a case like this. It makes us confront the dark side of humanity and think about the meaning of justice and the mystery that sometimes surrounds us.
You're so right. And speaking of mystery, let's talk about the impact the Black Dahlia case has had on pop culture. How has a case from 1947 managed to stay so relevant all these years later?
It's incredible, isn't it? The Black Dahlia case is like a permanent part of true crime. It's inspired books and movies and TV shows and even artwork. People just keep retelling the story and coming up with new interpretations.
It's like the case itself has become this blank canvas for artists and writers to express their own ideas about darkness and the unknown.
That's a really good way to put it. The Black Dahlia has become a cultural icon, a symbol of the dark side of Hollywood and the mystery that never goes away.
And people are still coming up with new theories about the case even today.
Oh, definitely. With the internet and social media, amateur detectives from all over the world can dig into the details and look for clues that might have been missed.
It's amazing to think that a case that happened so long ago can still spark so much interest and debate.
It shows how powerful this story is. The brutality, the mystery, the glamour, and the tragedy, all those things come together to create a narrative that really gets to people.
We're all drawn to the mystery, trying to make sense of something that seems impossible to understand.
And in a way, the fact that the case is still unsolved is what keeps it alive. It gives us something to think about, to puzzle over, to try and find our own answers.
We all become armchair detectives trying to piece together the clues and solve the mystery that baffled everyone else for so long.
And even though we might never know for sure who killed Elizabeth Short, the journey of exploring the evidence and thinking about the suspects and the context is what makes it so fascinating.
It's like we're all working together to understand not just the crime, but the darker parts of human nature and why we're so drawn to the unknown.
And that, I think, is the real legacy of the Black Dahlia case. It's a story that makes us question things, that intrigues us, and that reminds us that some mysteries might never be fully solved, but they can still teach us a lot about ourselves.
You know, it's crazy to think that a case this old can still feel so relevant today. What is it about Elizabeth Short that still has such a hold on us?
That's the question, isn't it? It's something that people have been trying to figure out for decades. Was it her looks, her innocence, her dreams that never came true, or was it the way she was murdered and how it all tied into the dark side of Hollywood?
Maybe it's all of those things mixed together. It's like the Black Dahlia case shows us the good and bad sides of life, fame and anonymity, ambition and tragedy.
Yeah, you've got a point there. It's that contrast between what Elizabeth Short wanted out of life and how it all ended. That's what makes it so powerful.
It's almost like a warning about the dangers of chasing your dreams in a place like Hollywood, a place that can be just as cruel as it is glamorous.
I see what you mean. And it goes back to the themes we've been talking about, the allure of ambition, the fact that life can be so fragile, and how darkness can hide even in the brightest places.
And we can't forget about the media's role in all of this. The way they reported the story, the headlines they used, all the speculation, it all helped create this myth that's lasted for generations.
Absolutely. The Black Dahlia case is a perfect example of how the media can shape how we see things. They turned a real tragedy into a spectacle, something that both scared and fascinated people.
It shows how even when people are trying to find the truth and get justice, things can get twisted and sensationalized. And that can sometimes make us forget about the real person at the center of it all.
That's so true. It's important to remember that beyond all the headlines and theories, there was a real woman, Elizabeth Short, whose life was cut short. And while we might never know for sure who killed her, we can still remember her and try to understand what her story means.
That's a good point. And it brings us back to why we're so drawn to the Black Dahlia case in the first place. It's a case that keeps us thinking, keeps us interested, and reminds us that some things might always be a mystery.
And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from all of this. Some mysteries might never be solved, but trying to understand them, wrestling with the unknown that can help us understand ourselves and the world a little better.
I like that. So to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this journey into the Black Dahlia case. I hope we've made you think a little differently about things and maybe even spark some new questions.
And if you're interested in hearing more stories like this, stories about unsolved mysteries and true crime and the history of Hollywood, make sure to subscribe to Tell Me More. We've got plenty more stories to tell.
That's right. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep those minds working. We'll be back soon with another fascinating story.